Welcome. Today, we are looking at terms of trade and Incoterms. This is a key topic in your commerce exams for SS3. Pay close attention. Let us begin. First, let me explain the meaning of terms of trade. Terms of trade refer to the conditions under which trade takes place between buyers and sellers. In domestic trade, terms of trade include price, quantity, delivery date, and payment terms. In foreign trade, terms of trade are more complex. They include who pays for transport, who bears the risk, who arranges insurance, and who handles customs clearance. To standardize these conditions, the International Chamber of Commerce created Incoterms. Incoterms are international commercial terms. They define the responsibilities of buyers and sellers in international trade. Incoterms are updated periodically. The latest version is Incoterms 2020. Using Incoterms reduces misunderstandings. Both parties know exactly what they are responsible for. This prevents disputes. Now, let me explain the importance of Incoterms. Incoterms are very important for several reasons. First, they clearly define who pays for what. The seller knows what costs they must cover. The buyer knows what costs they must cover. Second, they define when risk transfers from the seller to the buyer. If goods are damaged in transit, the responsible party is clear. Third, they define who arranges transport and insurance. The seller or buyer may be responsible. Fourth, they define who handles customs clearance. The seller may handle export clearance. The buyer may handle import clearance. Fifth, they reduce misunderstandings. Both parties use the same terms. There is no confusion about what is agreed. Sixth, they prevent disputes. If something goes wrong, the Incoterm tells who is responsible. Seventh, they are recognized worldwide. Incoterms are used in most international trade contracts. Now let me explain the classification of Incoterms. Incoterms are divided into two main categories. Incoterms for any mode of transport. Incoterms for sea and inland waterway transport only. The Incoterms for any mode of transport are EXW, FCA, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, and DDP. EXW means X works. The seller makes the goods available at their premises. The buyer is responsible for all costs and risks from that point. The buyer loads the goods, transports them, exports them, imports them, and delivers them to their final destination. EXW gives the seller the least responsibility. It gives the buyer the most responsibility. FCA means free carrier. The seller delivers the goods to a named place. The place could be a port, airport, or warehouse. The seller loads the goods if the place is their premises. The buyer arranges main transport. Risk transfers when the goods are delivered to the carrier. CPT means carriage paid to. The seller pays for transport to the named destination. The seller is responsible for export clearance. Risk transfers when the goods are delivered to the first carrier. The buyer bears the risk during main transport. CIP means carriage and insurance paid to. The seller pays for transport and insurance to the named destination. The seller is responsible for export clearance. Risk transfers when the goods are delivered to the first carrier. The seller must buy insurance. DAP means delivered at place. The seller delivers the goods to a named place. The seller is responsible for all costs and risks up to that place. The buyer is responsible for unloading and import clearance. DPU means delivered at place unloaded. The seller delivers the goods and unloads them at the named place. The seller is responsible for all costs and risks up to that point. DDP means delivered duty paid. The seller delivers the goods to the buyer's premises. The seller pays for everything. This includes transport, insurance, export clearance, import clearance, and duties. DDP gives the seller the most responsibility. It gives the buyer the least responsibility. Now let me explain the Incoterms for sea and inland waterway transport. These are FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF, and EXW when used for sea transport. EXW is not sea-specific. FAS means free alongside ship. The seller delivers the goods alongside the ship at the named port of shipment. The buyer is responsible for loading the goods onto the ship. Risk transfers when the goods are alongside the ship. FOB means free on board. The seller delivers the goods onto the ship at the named port of shipment. Risk transfers when the goods are on board the ship. The buyer pays for main transport and insurance. CFR means cost and freight. The seller pays for transport to the named port of destination. Risk transfers when the goods are on board the ship at the port of shipment. The buyer bears the risk during main transport. CIF means cost, insurance, and freight. The seller pays for transport and insurance to the named port of destination. Risk transfers when the goods are on board the ship at the port of shipment. The seller must buy insurance. Now, let me explain the key differences between the most common Incoterms. EXW gives the seller the least responsibility. The buyer does everything. DDP gives the seller the most responsibility. The seller does everything. FOB and CIF are very common. Under FOB, the buyer pays for main transport and insurance. Under CIF, the seller pays for main transport and insurance. Under FOB, risk transfers when goods are on board. Under CIF, risk also transfers when goods are on board. The difference is who pays. Under FOB, the buyer arranges and pays for shipping. Under CIF, the seller arranges and pays for shipping. Under FOB, the buyer arranges insurance. Under CIF, the seller arranges insurance. Under CFR, the seller pays for transport. The buyer pays for insurance. Risk transfers at the same point as FOB and CIF. Now let me explain how to choose the right Incoterm. Several factors influence which Incoterm to use. The bargaining power of the buyer and seller matters. A powerful seller may insist on EXW. A powerful buyer may insist on DDP. The nature of the goods matters. Perishable goods may need faster transport. High-value goods may need insurance. The buyer may prefer CIF to ensure insurance. The seller's expertise matters. A seller experienced in international shipping may prefer FOB or CIF. A seller with no export experience may prefer EXW. The buyer's expertise matters. A buyer experienced in import clearance may prefer EXW or FOB. A buyer with no import experience may prefer DDP. The cost matters. The parties will choose the cheapest option overall. The risk matters. The parties will try to transfer risk to the other party. The legal requirements matter. Some countries have rules about which Incoterms can be used. Now, let me explain the relationship between Incoterms and payment terms. Incoterms define physical delivery and risk transfer. Payment terms define when money is exchanged. They are separate but related. Common payment terms include advance payment, open account, documentary collection, and letter of credit. Under advance payment, the buyer pays before shipment. The seller has low risk. The buyer has high risk. Under open account, the seller ships first. The buyer pays later. The seller has high risk. The buyer has low risk. Under a letter of credit, a bank guarantees payment. This is safer for both parties. The choice of Incoterm affects which payment terms are appropriate. For a new buyer, the seller may require a letter of credit and CIF. For a trusted buyer, the seller may accept open account and EXW. A common exam question asks you to define Incoterms and state their importance. Here is a sample answer. Incoterms are international commercial terms that define the responsibilities of buyers and sellers in international trade. They are important because they define who pays for what, when risk transfers, who arranges transport and insurance, who handles customs clearance, and they reduce misunderstandings and prevent disputes. Incoterms are recognized worldwide and are used in most international trade contracts. Another exam question asks you to explain the different Incoterms. Here is your answer. Incoterms are divided into those for any mode of transport and those for sea and inland waterway transport only. For any mode, EXW, X-Works, FCA, Free Carrier, CPT, Carriage Paid To, CIP, Carriage and Insurance Paid To, DAP, Delivered at Place, DPU, Delivered at Place Unloaded, and DDP, Delivered Duty Paid. For sea, FAS, Free Alongside Ship, FOB, Free On Board, CFR, Cost and Freight, and CIF, Cost, Insurance, and Freight. EXW gives the seller the least responsibility. DDP gives the seller the most responsibility. FOB and CIF are the most common. Another exam question asks you to compare FOB and CIF. Here is your answer. Under FOB, the buyer pays for main transport and insurance. Under CIF, the seller pays for main transport and insurance. Under both, risk transfers when the goods are on board the ship at the port of shipment. Under FOB, the buyer arranges and pays for shipping. Under CIF, the seller arranges and pays for shipping. Under FOB, the buyer arranges insurance. Under CIF, the seller arranges insurance. FOB is often used when the buyer has better shipping arrangements. CIF is often used when the seller has better shipping arrangements. Let me give you a quick summary. Terms of trade define the conditions of a transaction. Incoterms are standardized terms for international trade. They define who pays, who bears risk, who arranges transport and insurance, and who handles customs clearance. Incoterms for any mode include EXW, FCA, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, and DDP. Incoterms for sea include FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. EXW gives seller least responsibility. DDP gives seller most responsibility. FOB and CIF are most common. The choice of Incoterm depends on bargaining power, nature of goods, expertise, cost, risk, and legal requirements. Keep reviewing, keep practicing. See you in the next topic.